Remember those initiative tasks you ran as an outdoor ed staff member or camp counselor? Those ones with the marbles that seem to frustrate kids to no end? Well, tune in today to hear how our guest, Kevin Amirault, turned a love of initiative tasks, metaphors, and building relationships into a career as a school social worker and how he works every day to bring a little bit of camp into the school building. Welcome to Beyond Camp, where we explore the intersection of camp in our lives. For too long, camp professionals have referred to camp as being in a bubble, and we're here to burst that bubble. We know that camp intersects with every aspect of our lives, and we're excited to delve into those with you today. We are your hosts, Rachel Kent. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Cassie Bloy. My pronouns are also she, her.
We're here to go beyond camp with you. As a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today, and be sure to check out the show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. Now let's get started. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Kevin Amirault. Kevin is a good personal friend of mine and also a master level social worker who's working as a social worker at a school in Ottawa. He grew up attending YMCA Camp Chief Hector in the Canadian Rockies and spent several summers working as a counselor there, and credits his camp experience as contributing to his life direction and fostering the skills to be successful on the path he's chosen. Kevin completed an undergrad degree in outdoor adventure leadership at Laurentian University, which is actually where our paths first crossed, before beginning work at the intersections of camp, education, and psychotherapy. First at the Boundless School, and then more specifically in adventure therapy at Wendigo Lake Expeditions, with a brief stint at Camp Kandalore along the way. So covered lots of ground geographically across Canada. Throughout Kevin's master's studies and his current role, Kevin's pursued an interest in nature-based and adventure therapy. Nature is a determinant of health, group dynamics and facilitation, suicide intervention, and emotion-focused approaches to mental health. Welcome, Kevin. We're really excited to have you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
We're really excited today to delve into sort of Kevin's story, how Kevin's experiences at camp have led to his path in social work, and just to share more stories of folks who've been impacted by camp along the way. So we'll turn things over to Cassie to get us started.
So as most of our listeners know, when we talk to a guest on our show, we like to figure out and learn about their identity and the different words they choose to identify themselves. So Kevin, how do you identify? What words would you use to identify yourself?
I think I would start sort of with a few of the ones that you might think of if you're looking at me on video. So I identify as male and also as white. But a few of my sort of other ones that I think are sometimes like attached to the camp experience is I come from a lot of economic privilege in terms of my so I would identify as coming from that. And then I think Rachel mentioned in the beginning social worker. Like I identify as a social worker, and I think that is sometimes like complex for me, and I get into a little bit more of that. Both that it's different from other types of counselors because we look more at like a whole person approach, but also that lots of people have had really negative experiences with social workers historically, and especially certain groups. So that part of my identity is a little bit mixed up. And then I would also identify as just a pursuer of flow, and I do that through mostly climbing and paddling right now. And if folks who are listening don't know what that means, it's sort of just like being into a state where you're 100% focused on one thing, and it's challenging enough to keep you focused, but not so challenging that it's frustrating. So whitewater canoeist actually would be more specific there. So I prefer to use one blade instead of two. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. I really like that you talked about your job being a social worker as being part of your identity, because Cassie and I have often talked about how being camp director was such a large part of our identity. Like if people ask, like, tell me about yourself, we'd be like, we're camp directors. And I think that there's not a ton of professions that necessarily align where people are like, my job is also part of my identity. So I think it's really interesting that you grew up at camp and you had some time at camp, and that this has also turned into something that aligns really strongly with your sense of self in terms of your professional life. And I think maybe we might dive into this a little bit later, but I'm fascinated when you talk about sort of your conflicted thoughts about your identity as a social worker as well in there, because I think that's something that we haven't necessarily had the chance to talk about with a lot of folks.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, did you want to talk about it more now or wait until?
Yeah, can you expand a little bit more on your conflicted feelings about that part of your identity?
Right. So as I was sort of starting to work in, especially at the Boundless School and then at Wendigo Lake, I sort of started to identify that, okay, I really do like doing stuff to do with therapy, right? Helping people to change, make changes, and learning a little bit more about how people's sort of internal psychological workings work. And then I started to say, okay, well, how could I pursue that? And so there's sort of some options, so a couple of routes that end up with the title of like counselor or psychotherapist, being a psychologist, being a psychiatrist, or being a social worker. And so I really identify with, social work's sort of ethic is more about, looking at the whole person, the person and environment, rather than saying, your brain, it's got a problem in it, and we need to figure out how to fix that sort of illness that's internal to you. So that's the part that made me really identify with social work. And then also, looking into the history of social work. So, something that hits me in my role as a school social worker is one of my other roles as attendance counselor. So if we search back in time to the residential schools, and maybe not that far back in time, the sort of adjunct to that was a truancy officer, which if Indigenous students did not attend residential schools, it was the truancy officer's job to get them there. And so, and then if we think about all of the families who've had negative experiences with children aid societies, that's where people usually, associate social worker with. So that, is a conflict for me in the sense that I have to grapple with the history of that and how I'm still implicated in some of those things. I still am sort of trying to bring kids to school when, school isn't always, a fully awesome place for them. And sometimes I have some punitive sort of aspects to my role. So but I still identify more with it than maybe what the other options would have been, because I feel like that idea of looking at the whole person helps.
Fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it is important to note that sometimes we can identify with things that we don't always love. And it's the idea that we can hold two ideas in tension, right? That we can love something and also be like deeply critical of it. And Cass and I've talked a lot about that before, but not necessarily in the context of identity. So I appreciate you sharing that. You touched a little bit on economic privilege, but we also like to discuss this because we want it to become part of our daily conversations. Do you think about your privilege? And it sounds like you do. In that case, what privilege do you feel like you carry, both in the camping world and then in your day-to-day life?
I think like in the camping world, sort of just having the opportunity to say to my parents, I want to go to camp, and that sort of being like, we can make that happen. And then saying, I want to go back next year, that can happen. And then saying, I want to go for a month this time. And then saying internally, I have to save for school, but I want to work at what might be a lower paying job over the summers to gain that experience. So I think that's an influence. And I think just, I had, success and got a lot out of camp. My camping experience, especially, the more backcountry or wilderness aspects of it, because, that was something that my family was able to do, right? And that speaks to economic privilege, both to be able to go someplace, have the time off, have the gear, all of those things. And I think that that just speaks to assumptions that you have to grapple with, right? When you meet with someone, you're going to put your own experience onto their experience. And so you have to sort of stop yourself. And so I think that applies to like my work in schools, to sort of say, okay, well, why don't you just do this to fix your problem? Or why doesn't your mom just help you out in this way, like drive you to school? That'll be helpful. Because in my experience, that economic privilege has meant that I've usually had access to a vehicle, right? And so I have to stop myself in my role and just sort of say, okay, am I going to ask this question? And then how do I ask it in a way that isn't, assumptive in the other way? So I don't want people to, to think that I'm assuming that they, don't have means because of either the fact that they're accessing social work or, So I think that's the way that I guess I grapple with it. And I think it's about the first aspect is noticing, and then it's like being able to catch yourself so that you're not, projecting your privilege onto someone else that might not have it.
I really like what you said there about also not assuming that people don't have the same privileges as you just because they don't present in the same way as you. I think that's really, really fascinating, and is a unique way of presenting that, because I think oftentimes people worry about that they're going to assume that everybody, accessing something or approaching something a certain way is poor, or am I assuming that everybody from one community is experiencing the same oppression? So I think that's a really unique way of approaching that. And there's lots to learn that's applicable to the camp world as well. When you think of yourself as a social worker and also as a leader, because you also spent some time as a counselor at camp and in some leadership roles there, do you feel responsibility or pressure to discuss your identity in any way? And if so, how do you cope with that pressure?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is that I do feel responsibility. I feel like maybe I would say that maybe I don't feel enough pressure, or if I think about other folks that have the same or similar privilege that I do, I think that I would like to see more impetus sort of put in the systems that we have on just sort of naming those things, because as I said before, right, that's sort of the first way to sort of interrupt something that might be coming out of privilege or oppression that is harmful to someone, is like, we need to be aware of it and talk about it. And if I was to talk about specifically like whiteness, like I think the sort of refusal to talk about it or acknowledge race is sometimes something that helps racism continue to sort of flourish. So I definitely feel that pressure. How do I deal with it? I think being able to sort of talk things through with sort of trusted folks. I think sometimes in my work we use the word like critical friends. So to be able to say, hey, I'm in this situation, I feel like maybe I should really be talking about my privilege or talking about my identity, but I wasn't sure about it. And then being able to have a space where you make mistakes and talk about those things. That's really helpful. So we have like an equity committee that I work with, and that's sort of where those are the people that I go to talk about those things.
Critical friend, I really like that phrase. We've sort of talked about like having a mentor or having like a phone a friend, but critical friend, I like that, because you need those folks in your life that both can point you in the right direction and also that are willing to say you are absolutely going in the wrong direction type of thing. Or I appreciate those people that keep me grounded. When you were discussing that a little bit there, so let me backtrack a second. You shared that you identify as a white man. So do you feel more pressure to discuss your privilege than you do your identities, would you say?
I would think that the pressure, I think, would be to put the identity out there, and then I think that depending on the space that you're in, that you're going to that's the privilege that comes out of that identity is going to be different, right? Like there are the tiniest bit of spaces in society where my identity as a man maybe not be a privilege, and so being open about that identity, I think is the first step, and then we can kind of negotiate in that environment. And I guess just to go back, what I was thinking about is that I am in social work. There's not a whole lot of male identifying folks in social work, and so sometimes that can be just something that like I can't connect on that one level of identity with some of the people that I work with. So
That's interesting. I actually didn't know that about social work. So learn something new every day, although I feel like we're learning lots here. Cassie, I'll pass it over to you. We're going to get into a little bit about your time at camp influencing your current career, and then we'll take a break and we'll get even more into that after our ad read. So Cassie, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. So Kevin, you're currently working as a social worker, and you've chosen this after what sounds like many, many years at camp. How did your time at camp influence your decision to enter this profession?
So I think it was like 11 years as a camper, then 5 or more sort of in various staff roles, and then you can include my other roles as kind of camp-like. in sort of the adventure therapy. And so, yeah, I think that if I look back on that, it's like such an opportunity to like build relationships with people and focus on sort of in those environments where relationships are really important. And so then I think that originally my thought was I really like being at camp. I really like being outside. I like sort of working with groups and those things. And I was like, I'm going to be a raft guide. That's what I want to do, right? I want to be outside, and I want to be outside for me. Because if I can get paid to be outside all day and do, camp-like things, that's great. And probably, the next line down there would be, continuing to work at camp. And then it sort of started to break down a little bit more to, okay, I have all these opportunities to be outside. Maybe I want to give that to other people. And sort of as I started to get a little bit older, and I started working at camp, and I saw sort of, how young people could be influenced and sort of, just become more like, I don't know, well people through experiences like that. And so I think that that's where I ended up for a while. And then it's sort of seeing how I could sort of help folks to make changes and improve their lives, improve how they felt about themselves through sort of those experiences outside. And I was like, well, maybe it's not all about outside. Like I still have a lot of my my role being, or what my interest is sort of the intersection of therapy and nature. But I sort of thought, how can I be in a profession where I can, use those skills to build relationships, really enjoy spending time with people, and help them to like make changes that they want. So I really feel like, what brought me into that was recognizing that like camp was doing that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and using the mechanism of like, the group process and being outside and all of those things. And then sort of being like, oh, I'm good at that. And I also really like that. And so let's see how I can make a career out of that. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing that you brought it all back to relationships. And I'm like sitting here, I'm like, we recorded last week, and we had a conversation about relationships being the forgotten part of what we do as camp professionals, or just in our day-to-day lives. Relationships are so critical to part of our well-being, I think, and just connecting it to that, and then being like, oh, but this is that thing that I also really enjoy, and pulling your identity into it as well. So like being outside and helping people build relationships and relationships with each other and themselves, like it fascinates me. So thank you for sharing all of that. We're going to take a quick break right here for our ad, and then we will be right back. Are you a camp professional looking for community and supportive colleagues? Are you a camp interested in accreditation, but unsure where to start? Are you looking for expert guidance in navigating the continually changing landscape of COVID-19 and the camp industry? Or are you just feeling stuck and just don't know what the next step is? ACA Illinois is available to talk with you about a wide variety of topics. And if they don't know the answer, they can definitely point you in the direction of someone who does. So don't hesitate to reach out today. Connect with them at info@acail.org and learn more about becoming an ACA Illinois member today. All right, Kevin, we are back and ready to hear so much more about your process from being a camper or a staff member at various types of facilities. So are there any lessons from camp that you carry with you now or reflect on as you go on, whether that's as a camper or a staff member, whether it's traditional camp or light camp, as you put it?
Mm-hmm. I think that the biggest thing, comes back to what we were talking about before, is how can I like identify sort of what in a new person that I'm meeting, is going to like help them to thrive, but also help them to make a connection with me. Because if I think about even just like, coming as a camper, right? It's a new a new group of folks, new leaders, sort of as, the camp group. And then, moving on to being a counselor and being like, hey, I got to get all these folks to work together, like each other, and also, feel a connection to me so that I can lead them. And so I think that I use, like, those set of skills I use every day when I'm like, and it becomes harder, right? Because it's not that excitement of being camp. It's the, oh no, something terrible has happened in my life, or I'm really struggling with this, or I need help with this thing. And then I need to be able to position myself as, yes, I can help you with that. And also, like, how do I just make some sort of connection so that you can know that, I'm a trusted person, right? And we think about, like, what is a kid coming to camp? You are standing in as a parent, as a camp counselor for that week. So, like, the basis of that is an attachment relationship. And so I think that being able to form those attachments and those relationships really quite quickly is something that I definitely, like, fostered over my years at camp, and then I use on the daily, I would say.
Really neat, because I feel like the relationships we form at camp are so unique. And I find it fascinating reflecting, it's been a while since you and I are like frontline camp counselors, in its like most basic sense, I guess. And I have been doing some work with some different populations here where I live now. And when I first started working with the group, the leader said to me, it's all about forming relationships. And, and it's funny, she also has a camp background, and she was like, so I can just talk to people about whatever, like, I'll just go up and be like, man, like, my feet feel sticky. Do your feet ever feel sticky? Do you hate that feeling? And I was like, oh yeah, I've got that covered. Like, I've had 1,000 of those bizarre conversations in my lifetime. And I consider myself to be a pretty introverted person. And so I think it's fascinating how well we can learn to form relationships in such an informal environment at camp, and remembering those skills that we've learned when we were 16, 17, 18, and how they can still help us out in our 30s is remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that comes to mind, sort of about what I brought with me from camp is, I've been, and maybe this is a sense of identity or privilege or something, like, I've often, in the situations that I've been able to be kind of like a high achiever, sort of looked at as somebody who knows what's going on and has sort of got things together. And I think my first experience of, like, understanding how that's not always something that I want to, like, step forward with first came from my camp experience as a camper, and sort of having the experience of being like, oh yeah, like, I'll be leader of the day, oh yeah, like, I'll, like, look at the map, oh yeah, like, I'll help clean up the dorm, like, those kinds of things were really helpful to the adults that I was working with, but didn't necessarily help me connect with everyone else that was in my group. And sometimes I was like, oh, like, I would get to the end of week 1 of a 2-week, and I'd be like, I don't know if I, like, have any friends here yet, right? And it's not because I'm being awful, but because I'm focusing so much on this, like, achievement and how can I be the best, that I'm not focusing on those relationships. And also maybe that comes off as trying to other myself from other people. And so that's something that I've brought forward in sort of being like, knowing when to step forward and be like, yeah, I can do that, I know this, I can, and when to, like, step back and leave space for other people, both so that they can thrive, but also so that I can learn about them, see their strengths, rather than always just being like, yeah, like, I got this, I'm the strong one. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's fascinating to hear you say that, because as somebody who went through university with you, I know that people are always like, yeah, Kevin knows what's up. And so I think that reflection is really interesting. I think that camp also often gives us a chance to feel a break from the pressure of having to perform to that high level. I think often we can take kids who are really high achievers, which comes with its own challenges that they face, especially in a world where kids feel such high levels of anxiety over a multitude of things, and a pressure to perform at such a high level. And you can take them to camp and be like, hey, like, you can step back, and being a leader doesn't always mean being the loudest or the highest performing. We need all of these others support roles to help the group move forward. So I like that you reflected on that. Thank you.
I can't remember a specific moment, but I'm sure that a counselor or two, like, brought me aside and was like, Kev, cool your jets, and that helped me. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. So you work in a school right now. We're going to sort of continue on this thread of how camp has shaped your work with young people. And so that's obviously different than some of the work that you've done when you've been at what we would call maybe like camp adjacent facilities or organizations. But how do you feel like, do you feel like you're able to bring camp into your work? And I know you've also been in this role during a pandemic, which has obviously shifted things a little bit. So also feel free to talk about maybe if you have different plans for when the world is less on Zoom and more in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of like learning things or making changes through experience is something that like I bring, and I have been limited, due to the pandemic, because we have to sit usually between plexiglass and whatnot.
Wow.
Yeah, usually like, yeah, plexiglass and masks and all of that. But I did have some opportunities. I've had some opportunities, especially with, the younger students that I work with, that it's really quite difficult for them to like just sit. And, some of the, I often get kids who are dealing both with something, like psychological going on or social going on, social difficulties, and then also like ADHD, right? Which again, if we think about, okay, come sit with this adult and talk about things for 40 minutes, that's going to be difficult. And especially when they're being told to do that all day. So yeah, bringing that experience in. So it's like anything that I can, and I think that's where, like different initiatives and things that we might see at camp, right? Where that's sort of come out of, is like, how can I create a metaphor for like whatever we're dealing with, and then have that student experience that. So if I'm thinking about like, I was trying to help a student to problem solve, and I happened to have like a classroom that I could work in. So it was a big space. And so I said, okay, so it's imagine like, your problem that you have to solve is throwing this marble, like rolling it across the floor and getting it into like, I had like a little bin at the other side. She tries and couldn't do it, right? So then we get the opportunity to talk about, okay, well, like what would help you, right? And that's the metaphor for like supports. So if you have a problem, yeah, what can help you? And so then it was like, oh, well, if I had like things directing it into there, right? So then we start putting things on in the classroom that are going to like help lead the marble into the spot. And so she's successful. And then the last part is, okay, like if we think about the problem that you're having, like, getting into fights at recess, what's the chair or the, the broomstick that's actually going to help you with that problem, right? So just sort of speaks to the experience of, I actually did something and I found that this thing was helpful, which, I think that that's what we get at camp or in these camp adjacent things. It's do something, and then afterwards we can talk about how this applies to, a larger problem, or sort of what we might call quote unquote real life, if camp is giving us a break from those things. So yeah, I try to bring in experience, like that, yeah, experiential, I guess would be the way that I would put it. That's what comes to mind first.
I said, that's such a classic like camp activity, like those initiatives, and they were, especially something like with marbles, was in every camp director's back pocket for like low budget initiative tasks. I feel like 18 and 19-year-old me spent many hours doing those. At times we're like, oh, these are frustrating. But it's like neat to see how those can then be used in what 18-year-old me would have been like, a really professional setting, but still like super applicable and so useful. I like that. Cassie, I'll pass it over to you as we look into wrapping up here.
I also like that it just kind of speaks to that creative mindset of kind of thinking outside the box. Like you went in with a marble, right? And you talked about support systems. And that just really kind of shows, like, I think how we take and continue to take camp with us outside of that space and think uniquely about concepts and problems, and how can I teach these in a more creative way.
And that thinking on your feet thing, right?
Yeah,
like it's
that
like
part.
it's like, oh, it's raining, so we can't do X, right? So what am I gonna do? Like it's it's like I show up to a school and I have my little bag of tricks, and I'm like, okay, that student I want to see, okay, I know they had a hard time sitting last week. What am I gonna do? Okay, I got a marble. Okay, what can I do, right? Which yeah, I think that ability to just, like think on your feet. And then also just the aspect, I think this speaks to like being in wilderness settings, or maybe, so being out on trip, or, just the experience of it's all you. So you got to figure it out. And maybe you got a, sat phone that you can call back. But I think that is something that has really helped me with crisis management, right? Like part of my role right now in the school is like, if there's something going on, principals or teachers will come to me and say, hey, this is happening with this student. Like, what do I do? And just to be able to like exude calm, because I've been in like so many situations where it's like, yeah, like, our canoe smashed, we might have to repair it, or somebody's got an injury or whatnot, or, they just don't want to keep going down the river today. How are we going to deal with it? And so being able to just be like, yeah, we got this, our team will handle it, and here's what we should do next. It really helps to bring that like sense of calm to the school, because folks are, even more this year, right, are sort of, their bucket is really full. And so something puts a drop more in, and they're like, oh my gosh, crisis. And I'm like, yes, crisis, but here's what we're going to do. We'll get through it.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. So maybe this is like the big question that we'll end on here, but what made you move away from camp and camp adjacent work?
Yeah. So I think it was mostly, sort of the first thing would be maybe not totally related to camp or camp adjacent, would be just that I wanted to continue working towards like being a therapist. And so that sort of moved me to a place that I was moving away from, the most recent camp adjacent place I was at, Wendigo Lake. But then I think there was the lifestyle factor would be like the second factor. So there I would be working on for 4 days at a time, or off at 4 days at a time. And for trips in the summer, like on for 13 days. And so it was sort of just thinking about a new stage in my life, and like, how does that fit? So that would be one of the things. And then it did just come down to, that program was working with youth who'd been through a lot of trauma and been through some really difficult things in their life. And so that's what they brought with them. And so I started to deal with vicarious trauma. So hearing stories and then having a caring response to folks, which then affects you. And then also just like, there was violence that I was dealing with there. And so eventually I just sort of was like, this has been a wonderful experience. I've learned so much. Maybe I'll want to come back to this. But for now, I need to give my brain a break from the intensity of experience that was.
Yes. And thank you for sharing all of that, because that sounds like a lot to help you form that decision, and a lot to be like, okay, no, it's time. And like that honoring of self, to be like, it's time for me to make a move to better my personal well-being in the end.
And I think there's a bit of an identity thing, right? When I'm thinking about, now here, obviously, I'm talking on this podcast, so like camp and sort of outside and camp adjacent things are such a big part of who I feel like I am. And so then to be like, okay, now, kind of, I go for walks outside the school with students, right? So that was a struggle to be like, when am I going to get back to this? Or am I ever going to get back to this? Or am I just, leaving this behind? And then in a sense, feeling like how important, like using just nature for like human development, how important that is. I just feel like now I have this tug back to like, hey, what can I do to make this, to bring this back into my life? And so then, I'm talking with Rachel, and it's like, hey, well, maybe I can come hang out on your podcast and talk about camp. Yeah.
You know me, I'm all about roping people into new things. So now I'm bringing Kevin back into the camping world. So
And totally fair. This is my camp bit every week.
Right.
So where I get that little bit of joy, per se. But thank you so much for sharing with us everything today, Kevin. Before we move on to wrap up our show for the day, can you share with our guests how they can reach out to you if they have any questions or would just like to connect with somebody about a similar experience?
Yeah, for sure. So feel free to reach out with me by email. And I think my email will be in the notes.
Yep.
Or as alternatively, if it works better for you, LinkedIn could work too, but not always there. So probably email would be best. And I would be really excited to talk with anybody about this kind of stuff or just about similar experiences.
Wonderful. We'll drop both Kevin's LinkedIn and email into our show notes for everybody. And before we wrap up, we always love to talk about self-care in our recharge station. And we all very strongly believe that it's critical to both personal wellness in both the good times and the difficult times. It's something camp professionals often struggle with, but we like to think of it as recharging our batteries or feeling inspired. So Rachel, what is our recharge station today?
Yeah, so my recharge station is my monthly coffee subscription. So I get my coffee beans delivered right to my door. And I will drop in the link for my Muskoka coffee because it also comes from the part of Ontario where my camp was. So it's like a little taste of home. And the reason that I would qualify this as self-care is because it's something that I love that I might not always take the time to source out where I live. And so I can automate that process and remind myself every day that I'm caring for myself in a small way. And because I'm frugal, it's something that I would already be spending my money on. So let's automate processes and also support small businesses. That's where my brain is at.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining us beyond camp. We hope that you were able to connect and reflect with us as we journey beyond the property lines and bring camp with us wherever we may go. As we wrap up, we want you to be able to reach out and connect with us. You can reach both myself and Rachel at beyondcamp@gocamp.pro. Please remember to check out our show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. So just flip those around. And one last big thank you goes out to Kevin for joining us today and making the time in his daily schedule for this, and to the team at GoCamp Pro for holding space for these conversations. To our sponsors, ACA Illinois, for continuing to support us and letting us chat every week. And to our producers, Matt and Jotham, for making us sound amazing every week. And to you, our listeners, your dedication to listening allows us to keep moving forward. Beyond Camp is part of the GoCamp Pro podcast network. Check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. Go well and safely, friends. We'll see you next time.